everybody. I'm happy to be here. It's exciting to see all of you here this afternoon, and to share a little bit about the work that we've been doing and a little bit about what we've been learning in the context of PB Chicago. And so just to give a highlight here, overall the goals have been to really think about and identify ways to improve access and connection around the civic platform for hard-to-reach populations. And in the context here, what we mean by harder-to-reach populations are, people who have been less likely to participate in civic initiatives with local government. So who is that, right? This isn't typically people, youth, people who are older in age, non-native English speakers, low-income individuals, and people of color in the context of Chicago. And then we've also been exploring, if the PB Chicago platform or using different civic technology infrastructure tools has increased resident trust in government, or what that's looked like, and what PB Chicago participants' perceptions around trust looks like, how or if there's been trust built in local government, and what their thoughts on that have been. So just brief here, there's been interviews and conversations with PB participants, aldermen and staff, review of historical documents, evaluation data, observations, national, global, PB research board documents, a lit review, and then just a note on the research limitations, right? In terms of very specific conversations around trust and interviews related to that, the sample size is pretty low. And pretty small. Overall, there was about 13 interviews, and so, that were specific to trust in government and civic tech. Otherwise, about 7 to 20 evaluation conversations with the board took place about annually. And so, those really looked at, what the boards were thinking about in terms of the platforms, how they were feeling about PB in general, what changes needed to be made, and their thoughts around local government, how that relationship was occurring. And so these are really very specific to the case of PB Chicago. So I think there are some tangible lessons learned here, but overall it's not generalizable. Just a note there, it's a case study. I see many of you are very familiar with PB Chicago, but I also see some new faces, so I just want to level set a little bit and provide some background on what is participatory budgeting and what is PB Chicago. So what is PB? It's a democratic process in which community members directly decide how to spend part of the public budget. This definition and framework is used not only here in Chicago, but used globally across the world. In Chicago, we worked with PB Chicago steering committee that was comprised of residents, ward staff, community organizing groups, and citywide institutions to really think about and develop what the process would look like. Part of that included developing guiding principles, and we came up with 5 over the course of 10 years that included equity, inclusion, community and coalition building, sustainability, and transparency. Just a little note about sustainability. Sustainability in this context wasn't really referring to green initiatives or climate change. It was really thinking about how do we build a sustainable process for people who are participating. Civic engagement initiatives can really be time intensive. So how do we think about the ways in which participants are engaging so that they want to come back? They want to continue to participate. They want to continue to learn about government. And it's not such a heavy lift and so time intensive that people are feeling burned out at the end. How does PB work? This is a very basic framework that is used for PB not only here, but again across the US and really across the world. In each one of these different phases, there's a lot of room for creativity and innovation. And actually across each of the wards and in schools in Chicago, there was a lot of variation in terms of how PB was implemented. But just to give you a basic framework, idea collection is really about gathering broad ideas about how the pot of money should be spent. So really going out into the community and saying, how would you like to see this money spent? What are the needs in your community? What ideas do you have that would really help build your community, or that you would specifically like to see this money spent on? Then taking those ideas, narrowing them down based on what's allowable in terms of the use of the money, what's related to those very specific regulations as it pertains to the money, and then having people do some real research and some cost estimates to come up with a full proposal in that proposal development stage. Bringing that back to the community, saying, give us some feedback in that project expo phase, hearing again from people, narrowing the ideas down further for a community vote, and bringing that back out to the community. And in Chicago, what we decided was anyone could vote who was 14 years of age or older and lived in a ward. So they did not need to be a legal citizen or a registered voter. And that was done really to think back again about those goals of equity and inclusion. And then how are we implementing and monitoring projects? And that really is an ongoing thing. And you see that the circle continues because it's meant to be an annual cycle that continuously occurs every year and is built upon and improved upon. So I'm really focused on the time period of 2012 through 2022, 2023, around in there. And over that time period, PB took place in 17 wards and 30 Chicago public schools across the city of Chicago. Today I'm going to focus mostly on what happened in the wards, but just so you have a sense of the scale. Over 45,000 residents participated and decided how to spend more than $51 million in public dollars, and approximately 450 community projects were co-created with residents. So this gives you a sense of where PD took place across the city of Chicago. The red dots are the schools. The dark blue are wards that, as of 2023, were currently doing PB. The light blue is areas that had previously done PB. And there are some wards that are doing PB now that aren't represented on this map, just so we're clear and aware. And there are wards that are dark blue that would have now be in a light blue. Here's a sense of what some of the projects that won might look like. So in the 45th ward, this was a playground that took multiple cycles to get done, and the residents came up with the idea. There was, at this Independence Park, there was a number of programs that were taking place that were in benefit of children that have disabilities. But the playground, as you can see, had no accessibility. There was no way for the children to actually use the playground. And the Park Advisory Council had been working for a number of years to try to make the playground accessible, and hadn't been able to raise any significant amount of funding to be able to do that. Over the course of multiple years of PP cycles, they were able to not only raise the money, but then leverage an additional $350,000 in resources, actually, I'm sorry, $560,000 in state of Illinois funding to do a complete renovation to the playground. There's another similar type of project where through PB, the youth proposed a improvement to their school that was also accessible to the wider community. The vote won about $100,000 on the ballot, and it leveraged about $4.5 million in additional city resources to improve the field at Steinmetz School. So just to give you a sense of what kind of projects are winning, they're basic infrastructure projects like street resurfacing, lighting repairs, murals, improvements to schools, parks, things along those lines that are happening in the wards. The money that is used in Chicago wards is basic infrastructure money, so it's limited to those types of projects and improvements. So just a note here now, shifting to the type of civic infrastructure. And when I'm talking about civic infrastructure, just so you have a sense of what I mean when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about both sort of like the physical spaces, the technology, as well as the process with local government by which PB is taking place. So here's a timeline of PB and the civic infrastructure through which it has taken place from 2012 through 2024. And so PB, the first instance of participatory budgeting started in 2009, which is off the timeline here, in the US in Chicago. In 2012, which is on the timeline, that's when it really began expanding throughout the city of Chicago to additional wards. Pretty much from 2012 through 2015, PB was in person. It was taking place in the wards, in-person meetings. Idea collection was happening by going directly out onto the street and asking people for ideas. The amount of technology that was used was really limited to emails, maybe some social media. But there wasn't really other types of civic technology that was being implemented. It was very in person, it was very focused on deliberative democracy. And even the vote was really taking clipboards out and going out and meeting people where they were at and getting people to vote that way. In 2015, we piloted the first online voting in a partnership with Stanford and their crowdsourcing team to really think about, okay, how can we really start expanding a virtual and online component? That was an interesting pilot in that a lot of what ended up happening was having laptops available at in-person voting sites. So most people ended up not using it online, but just voting on an electronic ballot in person. And you can see that there was about 9% online virtual voting overall. From 2015 moving forward until 2020, where 2021 actually is where we launched a full PB platform. You can see that there was a steady increase in the use of technology, where it kind of grew 13 to 32 to 23% over time, and that included the use of online ballots, it included using more social media, it included using more Facebook, both as a way to not just conduct outreach, but as a way to start collecting ideas, as a way to start pushing people to vote online. So there was a steady adoption of those types of technology, but as I mentioned early on, there's a lot of variation in how each ward conducts their PB process. So each ward was using technology differently, and each ward was using it in a way that fit how both the ward's staff capacity and their assessment of how to engage their own population. In 2019, when COVID hit, there was a jump to 52% of online voting. And then when the lockdown happened, PB shifted, and Chicago was one of the few in the United States where their PB process did not shut down completely, where we actually continued, where most participatory budgeting across the US paused, if not discontinued. We jumped to a 94% online voting overall, and there was a decision to launch a PB platform. Then in 2022, unfortunately, all of the funding for participatory budgeting in Chicago was discontinued, and the wards began to shift back to hybrid models where it was much more in person with some virtual and online voting. And then in 2023, that shift continued, and in 2024, the PB platform was discontinued. And as we know now, the wards are using a mix of in-person and online voting tools, as well as a mix of different kinds of online voting tools. So everything from Google Forms to the Stanford tool to creating surveys. There's a wide variety of range. range of tools that are being used. So the PB Chicago platform, just to have a little bit of background on that, we used a Decidim platform, which is open source technology, and the idea behind it was to centralize and coordinate the tech tools across the wards and to increase transparency as well as to ease and increase participation online, predominantly during the uncertainty around COVID. You can have a couple pictures here. One of the things that was really interesting about the platform was that people could submit ideas, they could submit proposals as well as vote all on one platform. So that was one of the ways in which people were really interested in it, as opposed to submitting an idea through an email or through Facebook and then voting through Stanford and having the wards have to kind of collect it. PB participants could submit an idea, track whether or not it moved on to the proposal development phase, why or why not, track whether or not it moved on to the ballot, and then be able to vote on it. So you could see the trajectory of an idea all the way through a PB process. So as we implemented the PB platform, there was a number of different evaluations that we held individually with wards and then together collectively. And a lot of what we heard from wards was that they did like the centralization of PB information across the city. Many of the wards were interested in what was happening across other wards. They looked at it to gather ideas, to see how other wards were doing their processes. They liked that it improved transparency of the process. People could track where ideas and proposals were going, what was accepted, what wasn't, why it wasn't accepted. And they found that for administrators, it was easy to navigate compared to some of the other tech tools. On the other side, though, there was a lot of barriers to participation. In order to really engage and participate on the platform, you had to create a login, which was difficult for some populations. There was some confusion created because it was one, let's go back here. It was one PB platform, and on it, you would see every single ward. So if you're a resident and you see that says wards PBs, you click on that and then you would see every single ward participating across the city. So you needed to know what ward you lived in and whether or not you could participate there. So some residents were trying to vote in wards or participate and submit ideas in wards that they weren't living in, and it created confusion for residents about where they could participate and where they could not. Because people had already been using a variety of different tech tools for voting, this offered one solution. And so it really limited the voting methods and tools that the wards had available. So in addition to like a Google form or the type of tech tool available, many PB wards were also experimenting with different voting methodologies. So rather than just using approval voting, such as you get 5 votes, pick your top 5 projects, they were also experimenting with other types of ballots, like you're given the amount of money, $1 million, and the vote tells you how much you've spent, and once you go over $1 million, you can't select any more projects. Knapsack voting or ranked choice voting, those types of methodologies, which weren't available on the platform. So really specific to harder to reach populations, a lot of what we also heard from people were that there was a big digital divide, and there was also a need to really think about how we were addressing digital literacy. And so you saw and heard people talk a lot about the need for clearer language, the need for language access, the need for improving the quality of translations. We also heard a lot about, talk about a generational shift in the ways in which some populations were engaging with the platform and others. And we heard a lot from people about the need for it to be more visual in general, that it was too text heavy, and that people were also wanting more mobility with the platform, that it needed to be more cell phone accessible. So specific improvements that were suggested were SMS texting, and simplifying it, making it more user-friendly, more visual, utilizing a hybrid approach where you were doing kind of pairing the use of the platform with in-person meetings to really walk people through how to use the tech tool or using the platform while you were also in an in-person meeting to build familiarity and comfort with it. Also increasing data security so people felt really secure in what was happening with their information and their data. And then, just making it more visually appealing. Best practices that I was able to also kind of pull up that I thought might be interesting for folks here were from some other research is, again, really making sure that you're assessing digital literacy and the digital divide of the marginal groups that you're engaging with before launching the platform. This research came out after we launched our platform. So, and then really thinking about harm mitigation strategies, such as making sure you have moderation on the platform, which we did. But I think that's really critically important. We heard from folks as they were using the platform about, as people were, similar to what you see on social media, as people were interacting with different proposals or things, making sure that there was somebody there who could moderate comments and make sure that they were appropriate and constructive. And then, again, making sure that there's an anonymity option so that engagement feels safe for everyone who's on the platform. We're kind of shifting to this trust building aspect. I think one of the things that we heard from folks really was a lot about transparency and accountability. And one of the things the platform did was increase that transparency piece and that accountability piece, because you could really see where things were in process. We also heard that the centralization of information and simplifying information was really important and critical, again, for people. That when it's done well, that really is helpful for people. I think what's interesting, and I'll get onto this in the next piece though, is the transparency is a bit of a mixed bag, right? And so we heard both, we heard a lot about transparency on both sides of that coin. We also heard that technology is really a communication tool, so the technology in and of itself is not what's building the trust, but it's the ways in which technology is being used or utilized, right? So is the technology effective in the ways in which it's being used to communicate? Again, is that information that's being shared in a way that is clear? Is it accessible? Is it easy to understand? Which, when we're talking about government systems and information, even something like small infrastructure projects, they can become quite complex. And so making sure that that information is shared in a way that's easy to understand. And then the other things that we heard were that the uneven levels of adoption of technology and comfort with technology sometimes were really impeding trust building. On the other side, we heard that technology gives a perception of greater accuracy and neutrality, and that then also aided in trust building. So so a little bit more, the number one thing that I would say we heard from people when it came to building trust in local government was, are they seeing results? And are the projects being built? And are services being provided by government? And so you can see this reflected in the quotes here. And so, when projects were taking a long time to be built, there was frustration on the side of residents, like, is it really happening? Why am I participating? You see the ward staffer saying, we do this, we build trust through PB, but then, it doesn't happen. And we have to wait a long time, and we can't meet the services in a timely enough manner. And so then trust is broken, or residents feel as though trust is broken. And with transparency, we heard again sort of this kind of push-pull, right? This tension, where there's a lot of research out there that talks about how an increase in transparency has a significant positive effect on trust in government. But in practice, this really is, again, kind of about what information is out there. It's not just dumping data, right? And what we saw in PB was that there's a desire on the part of many residents to have access to all the information. And then something so simple as, this quote from the PB participant that says, I know something was submitted, but the timestamp shows that it was submitted yesterday, but I know it was submitted a different day, and now I'm suspicious, right? And so because there's already a level of distrust, something so small as a timestamp then furthers that level of distrust rather than helping to promote it. And this desire for all the information, right? And this sense that transparency means we're going to have all the information and we're going to have it in a really timely way, coupled with this tension around needing the information to be accessible and clear and visual. And what does it take to translate complex government information into a format that is accessible and clear and visual, right? And the capacity of ward staff to be able to do that in a quick and timely manner. There was a real tension there in the wards around being able to do that in a way that helped build trust. And so I think some of the other things that we saw was really the need for ongoing communication updates and using those ongoing communication updates to enhance public education and understanding about how government works, right? So what do I mean by that? When I saw, in some of the wards where I saw trust building happen really effectively, work really effectively, was when they walked people through in a lot of detail. Well, what does it mean that this project's delayed? Why is it delayed? What's the information about what's happening at CDOT in terms of the very specific around what happens with putting in a light pole, right? So it's getting really down into the details and the weeds around building infrastructure and the processes inside of government that it takes to build each specific thing, so that you're really highlighting all of that information for people and walking them through the government processes. I think some of the lessons learned that I take away from this is when we think about trust building, it's like, really what are we thinking about? Trust in who and for what purpose? And so, we heard a lot about, I think we, as researchers and as practitioners, we need to really think carefully about, defining what we mean by this. Are we talking about local government? Are we talking about aldermen, public administrators, the mayor? Trust built through civic initiatives does and has shown through a lot of research that and more positive attitudes, trust does develop over time, but I have observed that does not necessarily transfer from these personal relationships into the broader city of Chicago or other city departments. That those relationships and that trust must also be built over time. And then, in addition to that, residents are not coming into these civic initiatives without a history or without other experiences. PB is not happening in a vacuum, right? They're happening in the context of people having day-to-day interactions with local government. And so when we think about how we're building trust and what it takes to build trust, it takes this intentional, sustained, coordinated efforts. And if we're thinking about it at the scale of city, then that would need to take place across multiple departments and agencies where there also needs to be consistency over time. And one of the things that became really critical was thinking about how are we defining transparency in practice. As you're launching an initiative and talking about the goal of transparency, what does that actually mean in practice? What's the expectation and the promise that we're making to participants? So that it doesn't become a tension between how much information and how fast, but it can serve more as an aid in that trust building. And then related more to the civic platform and technology, it can then increase that. It served to increase transparency because it has been further defined. These platforms and technology, though, we learned they need appropriate staffing. The virtual engagement required almost the same amount of staff time as in person, and for many of the ward offices, their time is limited, and they did not have previous experience as administrators of civic platforms, so there was a learning curve. And then to effectively engage harder to reach populations, staff needed to be on hand to train, to really be able to roll it out in an effective way that oriented people in person, right? To help them walk through the platform, to feel comfortable using it, and provide tech support. And I think also thinking about the timing and the purpose of why you're using technology. For us, it was really a solution to COVID rather than something that was integral to the overall goal of participatory budgeting in Chicago. And so as soon as the challenges we were facing with engagement overall, with being able to meet people in person due to the pandemic, started to go away, the need and purpose of the platform also began to wane. We did find the use of hybrid and in-person, using both in-person and virtual engagement for hard-to-reach populations to be critical, as well as really thinking through what does it mean to provide translations for hard-to-reach populations. We had Google Translate, but it's limited, and I think we saw a lot of desire for people to have real-time translations. And so I think in conclusion, I would say our experiment in both has been really fruitful in terms of learning how to build trust. We did build a lot of trust. The platform served an amazing purpose and helped us really think through what kind of tech tools are needed and necessary and what would work in Chicago and what needs further improvement. And yeah, I'll leave it at that and welcome any questions.